This episode of the Music Production Podcast is sponsored by Core Sound. Core Sound is a new, cool, AI-powered tool for successful bloggers, music makers, and video productions. It takes into account both the trending listening habits as well as the rhythm, speed, progression, and instrumentation of audio recordings. Try many tracks to find the perfect match and create compelling content. Think like a professional music editor with Core Sound. Easy-to-use, cutting-edge digital assistant that works where you do. Simply add a track to the Core Sound app. Core Sound automatically analyzes the track's quality across genres and charts, giving it a score out of 10. Find out which genres and charts your music fits best. If you want to use the best music for your story or video blog, or check your track's audio quality, Core Sound is your secret weapon. Now you'll always know how to choose the best music for your piece of art at Music Stocks. Core Sound is your personal AI sound producer. Core Sound is available at the App Store. How's it going, everybody? And welcome to the Music Production Podcast. I'm your host, Brian Funk. On today's episode, we're doing sort of like a crossover podcast interaction thing with the Tunelighting podcast, which is done by Rob and Jack. And they are doing an album over the course of a year, and they're documenting the whole process. So you guys have been like longtime friends and musicians, and you've decided now you're going to work together to make an album. And to sort of hold yourselves accountable, you're doing a podcast about the process, and it's been pretty fun. I think you guys are about like 4 months into it now.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, so welcome aboard.
Yeah.
It's good to have you guys. I should say this, though, before we really get into it. This is going to be the first part of the episode, and then we're going to have the second part of the episode on the Tunelighting podcast.
That's right. A bit of an experiment we're doing here, but hopefully it'll work well. But
to kind of send people this show to your show and people to your show to this show.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Well, thanks very much, Brian, for having us on. And I've been listening to your podcast for a few years now. So personal fan. So thanks for having us on. It's really good.
Nice. Yeah, I'm really happy you guys made it. So let me ask you about the idea of this podcast, how it got started. How's it been going?
Yeah, it really was. It came out of. Me and Jack have known each other. We've been friends since we were pretty young, neighbors basically. Since we were very young, and it was probably when we were around. And correct me if I'm wrong, Jack, but around the age of about 14, 15, we went together to a high school Battle of the Bands night, and kind of just on a whim, and as we were there, we after it finished, we were walking home, and there were two other friends with us, so there were four of us that went to this thing, and we just looked at each other and said, "Why don't we just start a band? That'll be fun." And none of us really knew any instruments. I think one of us, our friend Mike, he knew how to play the bass guitar, so we had a start. But apart from that, we were pretty much starting from nowhere. But it seemed like a cool thing to do at high school to start a band. And we saw the older kids doing it at the Battle of the Bands and thought it'd be a good thing to do. So after that, we kind of went home and learnt some instruments as best we could and formed this band. And then ended up playing together for a few years after that. Got semi-serious. I mean, we thought we were good. We were gigging around the local town and things like that. And you think at that age, you're like, maybe this is it. Maybe this is the career path now. We're going to be musicians. But as I'm sure many people, it just kind of petered out as life got in the way. But you never really lose that spark of wanting to make music and wanting to create music, I guess, after that, after we got older. And me and Jack have always been just making music at home in our spare time, kind of sharing ideas and things like that. But 10 years or so passed and we didn't really have anything to show for it. And about 6 months ago, we got together and we said, it would be really good if we could actually finish something. We've got all these ideas are sitting on our laptop, sitting on our hard drive, these musical ideas, but we've never, even when we were a band, we never really got to a stage where we released an album or anything like that. And we just sat down, probably after a few beers one night, and just said, wouldn't it be cool if we just finished a project, finished an album together? And so we agreed to that pretty quickly, and it was. But then we thought, we've said this before. I said to Jack, we've done this before. We've said, let's finish something. Let's do an EP, and it just never happened. So that was what gave us the idea. Why don't we give ourselves some accountability and start a podcast to kind of document the process along the way? Because that is the ultimate accountability in a way. You start getting listeners listening in, and every week, you're holding yourself accountable to report how it's going on and things like that. So yeah, it was that really started it, and it went from there. So it was kind of a selfish thing in a way, but from that it's evolved, and now it's become a thing in its own right. The podcast, we really enjoy doing it, and it's a great way of forcing ourselves to learn. But the idea is, I'd like it at the end to be not I guess a template or something that other people could look at as a process from start to finish of how, if they want to do it themselves. We came up with this word Tunelighting, which is the name of the podcast, which after a lot of deliberation about what the podcast should be called, and that's a word we completely made up ourselves, which we like to think kind of reflects this process of doing an album, writing an album in your spare time. So we're carrying on with our normal jobs, our day jobs. We've not packed it all in to write the album. We're going to do it on the side, as it were. And yeah, that's this new word, Tunelighting, and that's what it's meant to mean. So yeah, that's a kind of brief history of where we're up to, really.
That's like a play on moonlighting, right?
Exactly. Yeah,
that's cool.
I was hoping that we were worried that people might not get it straight away, but I think most people we've spoken to, you weren't worried.
No, got a smart audience.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny that you guys have that story of like starting the band, after going to the Battle of the Bands. I was 14 when I started playing guitar, and it might have been like that year in school or maybe the next year, where I went to the talent show and there was a band playing, the older kids were playing, and I had no idea that anyone had a band in high school, like that there was a band, and it was just like larger than life to see in front of me. And it was one of those things that was just like, I have to do this, and started like gathering whoever I could that I knew did something, or showing friends like how to play the bass, like just move your finger from here to here. Like we weren't playing complicated songs, but we had probably like a little trail of people that we convinced to buy guitars and basses, trying to put together a band. But it makes me just think how important those experiences are when you're a kid, to see that and like realize like, wow, those guys are doing it. Like we could do that.
Yeah, I think when you start, especially with kind of basic rock music, pop music, you don't appreciate how easy it is to get going and play songs, famous songs that are on the radio, to a reasonable standard. And I think it's quite, once you see someone else doing it and you realize actually anyone can with not much time and a little effort, it's quite an accessible thing to do once you make the connection.
Yeah, it's not impossible. It's tough to master, but not too tough to get.
Tough to go all the way, but to get to Battle of the Bands high school stage, I think that's...
Well, fun story. We didn't make it into the first talent show we tried out for.
Oh, well, maybe it's tougher than I'm giving it credit for.
Yeah, we did not make it. We had kind of a rough audition. I think we had like broken strings in the middle of it, and the other bands had like PA systems, and we had like a old PV amp we stuck a microphone into.
I mean, it's a funny story. I think this must be a recurring kind of theme, but from our first ever gig we did, I remember we were really good setup. The drums were all mic'd up. Because we'd been practicing in not like a garage or something. Terrible sound. We got to this first gig, and everything was mic'd up, and it just sounded amazing. And I remember the person who was running it after the sound check saying, "You guys sound really tight. It's great. You're going to be awesome." Walked out for the first song. I struck the first chord. My E string on the guitar just snapped straight away. First note. So immediately, I'm not an experienced musician. I don't know what to do. Just carried on. But the problem was that song, I think about 90% of it was on that string. Right. So it was a bit of a disaster. But you learn quickly with playing live, definitely. And it's doing it that, I don't think I ever quite, it's been about 10 years since I did a gig. So maybe we'll get back into gigging after we've done the album. But I don't think I ever quite mastered it. There always seemed to be something that went wrong.
That's the excitement and the thrill. It's kind of like walking the tightrope without the net.
Yeah, exactly.
But I guess you do learn things like bringing an extra guitar. Like we learned that one quick, or to like don't stop. Don't give up. Don't let it frustrate you. Like kind of
style it out.
Yeah. Laugh about it. It's. I've seen shows and played with bands where something goes wrong and they have like a fit on stage, and that's not good. It doesn't make anyone feel comfortable, and it turns like a bad situation much worse.
I know. I've got so used to being in the studio, my home studio now, that recording at home and things like that. It's you get used to just doing lots and lots of takes, and I guess it's something we've been thinking about a lot in kind of the album writing process is creating that live, capturing that live sound, I guess. But you do. I'd be very nervous going back to playing live. That's for sure. After being in the studio for a long time and having that comfort of hundreds of takes and no one else watching.
Right. So Rob, you played guitar. Jack, what did you play?
I played drums in a band, and I learned from scratch. For some reason, after the Battle of the Bands, I was convinced I was going to be the drummer, despite having zero experience and no drum kit. I think maybe it's just because just at school I'd start tapping out rhythms on the desk with my hands sometimes, and I thought, well, I'm a qualified drummer basically. So I managed to find a cheap kit off eBay, and I learned pretty quickly. I learned the basics pretty quickly. Took me a little while to get good, I would say, but I managed to. I was a serviceable drummer to begin with, which was enough at the time.
Yeah, keep the beat.
Our biggest problem was getting kicked out of rehearsal places, wasn't it? Really, it was. We got kicked out of Jack's garage, then kicked out of my garage, then like we were practicing above some brewery. Maybe we just weren't very good, and that was the reason we were getting kicked out of these places. Maybe it wasn't a noise thing. It was finding somewhere to practice where we could play loud. That was the big thing when we were younger, I remember. All you want to do is just turn the distortion levels up on the amp and crank everything up to full volume and annoy the neighbors.
Yeah, I think that was something we found out even when recording. On a few occasions we did hire a studio out and try and get some tracks down. We didn't quite understand that to have a big chorus, you didn't need to always turn the distortion up full on the bass and the guitar and everything. And I think some of the producers we worked with or studio owners were quite surprised when we had these fairly melodic songs and we'd get to the chorus and suddenly all the distortion pedals came on and it just occasionally sounded a bit of a mess. But I think we've got a little bit better in the 10 years since restraining ourselves in that sense.
Yeah. Right. Well, I think I used to do the same thing. That the gain knob was always all the way up, like just where it was. You didn't have to ever move it. But a lot of the music I think we were listening to at the time relied on really heavy distortion, especially in the choruses. I'm thinking about bands like alternative grunge and stuff like Nirvana and Smashing Pumpkins. Like they always had like these ridiculous distortion sounds, crazy feedback. So of course that's what we wanted. But there's a weird paradox when you record it. Like when you're playing live, it can just keep getting louder and louder and louder and louder. And it usually does when you have a bunch of guys. Our first band had 3 guitar players and a bass player and a drummer. So we were always at war on the volume end of things. But when you're recording, it's like the more stuff you add, the smaller everything becomes. There's this weird paradoxical effect. So like when you get to the studio, it's probably like that's when it all like starts to fall apart on you.
Yeah, definitely found that.
Yeah, I think that's the big difference between us now. I guess we're kind of approaching this project more as producers, from a producer's angle, than a band, which makes a massive difference. When we were younger, we were a band first and foremost, and then we would occasionally try and record some songs at a studio. And it's a big kind of it's a thing that we've realized now recently, how much of a benefit it is to be able to take your time to experiment and not be kind of restrained. We would pay back then. We would pay for a time slot of a couple of days to get down a few tracks, and it would be that, and you'd come away feeling like you could have done more, or it wasn't quite right. And I think we were kind of, we didn't know the producers or the studio owners. We were just paying someone we found online for the time, and you always felt like they mixed it kind of in 5 minutes or so. They weren't spending hours and hours doing it, and we couldn't afford to pay them very much money. So yeah, it's completely different now, and you kind of realize as you learn more and more about production and things like that, how difficult it was to get a good sound here, knowing as little as we did and things like that. So it's been an eye-opener, definitely, and it's kind of it's at the age of, well, we're both 30 now, feel way more prepared to write and record an album than I ever did when I was playing in a band. It's kind of, and that's one of the things we found frustrating growing up and getting older, is you always felt that music was a young man's game or a young person's game, kind of. If you don't make it when you're younger, and you see so many bands that became famous when they were teenagers and then worked their way up and releasing albums, and you think when you get to your mid-20s, you're like, well, that's it. We've not gone pro, so we might as well draw a line under it now, and anything else we do is just kind of messing around on the side. And then it was kind of when me and Jack got together, like, actually we know loads more about music production now, because we've been doing it in our spare time and reading around it and stuff like that. Like, why don't we try and record that album that we never got round to? It doesn't have to be. I think we accepted that it's fine to not be, to be slightly older and still do it. It's fine. You don't need to be 20 and releasing your first album. You can do it whenever.
Yeah, I think that's changed a lot too over the last couple decades, where a lot of artists are actually a bit older. I mean, like, if the Beatles were, the Beatles would have been over for like 3 years by now in your life, I think.
Yeah, exactly.
I think they were like 28 or 27 when they broke up. Like they weren't very old anyway.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Like, and you mentioned Nirvana, like he died at 27. I mean, just, it's incredible when you like think about like the work some people like manage to throw together in such a short amount of time. But I think that's changed a lot too, and you can record whenever you want. There's no like age restrictions, and no harm. It's good.
Yeah, and I guess we're so lucky now, well, you get a bit more money obviously if you have a job and as you grow older, but just the accessibility of equipment and being able to kind of self-produce and to a decent standard at home, and you've got the internet access to all the knowledge that's out there in terms of all the YouTube videos, podcasts like yours, just to get all this knowledge. It really did feel like when we were younger, and I guess it was the same for bands back then, that you would have to do it professionally and all the time, because you would need to go to a studio and take out that studio time and really pay a producer and do it properly. Whereas the accessibility to equipment and the ability to do it yourself is, that's changed massively in the last 5 years, but the last 10 years definitely. We can get access to pretty much everything we need for an affordable price and quite easily. So that's a massive change as well.
Yeah, for me, starting off like the recording on like karaoke machines, tape cassettes,
exactly.
like, and then finally got a 4-track tape recorder that was pretty amazing. But like, you were just never going to get anywhere near studio quality, CD quality, we would call it at the time. But now, yeah, like that access to quality is, pretty much anyone with an iPhone can make a pretty decent sounding piece of music. Much better sounding quality, fidelity than it was back when I was doing it. So it's a pretty neat thing. I had like a kind of like a breakthrough for me when, so I guess we were probably just turning around 2021 or so. A friend of mine and I put all our money together and we bought the first thing we ever bought off the internet or on eBay. And it was these ADAT machines. They're basically VHS tapes. They're digital. And it sounded really good. Like it was such a giant leap from what we had. And it was really exciting. And I know I, for a little while, got kind of obsessed with like everything. Okay, mic placement. I'd spend like forever trying to place my mic. And I had a compressor. And so I had some EQ, and like that was it, no plugins or anything. So I spent so much time like trying to get everything right when I was going to record that like I kind of lost the momentum of wanting to record.
Yeah.
But I did make this decision to just decide I'm not even going to worry about any of that stuff. Because even if I do a bad job placing the mic or I don't do the compressor right, which I certainly wasn't because I had no idea. I didn't even know what it was doing. I just knew I was supposed to do it. But as soon as I let go of that and just said, I'm just going to record it just as fast as I can, not worry about that stuff too much, that freed me up so much. It took, because, like, kind of what you were saying, like you would go in the studio, you have the engineer, you have the producer, you got all these people helping you because you don't know how to do it. But now you are all of those people and you're the talent, you're the artist, you're the songwriter and everything. So it's really hard to go back and forth between all of those hats. Once I decided to take the engineer, mixer, like producer hat off a little bit, it really helped me move forward. And, I probably could have recorded things a little better, but I recorded them. Otherwise, I wouldn't have gotten to record them. I would have maybe had a really cool drum sound.
I remember when we first started trying to record our own music, but it was when laptops or computers hadn't got to the stage they are at now, and it was little things like latency and just things that would creep in back then that prevented you from really getting going. It was just much more fun to play live and just mess around than when you actually got to try and record your own stuff. Like you say, you'd be trying to set up the mics and do things and it would never quite sound right. Whereas now, anyone can, even on an iPhone, get a pretty cool sounding thing. You can go on something like GarageBand on an iPad or something and make a song that sounds almost studio quality just with barely any knowledge. So it's daunting in a way because so many people can access these things, and it almost gives you no excuses to not do anything. But it really has changed a lot, and it's made things a lot easier. That's for sure.
So, what kind of music are you guys doing for the album?
That's a great question. We're still sort of at the stage of trying to figure that out. We've got a few kind of styles that we seem to be leaning towards. Even when we were in a band, and it's kind of the same now, without wanting to sound too kind of cliche about this, I wouldn't say we could fit neatly into one genre. We grew up with a lot of kind of indie music, alternative rock music. So those are our kind of base points, if you like. We're usually rooted in, but these days we listen to a lot more electronic music as well, bits of folk, and all these kinds of things get get mixed in. And I know Rob and I are quite interested in trying to make an album that sounds cohesive, which means that at some point we need to make a decision about which of these elements stay and which of them go. And that's kind of happening as we speak. It's sort of something we're trying to decide these next few weeks, really. We've got at the moment, we've got a kind of mechanical sound where we sort of use found sounds and kitchen implements and things, especially for a percussive side of things. And that kind of naturally gives it this quite robotic metronomic feel, which is quite cool. So we like incorporating that.
Yeah, it's something we've talked about on the podcast, is we're trying to kind of fast track, I guess, the process that a lot of bands would go through over maybe a series of years. And we've gone like, if we started off at the start of the podcast, like thinking of a name, and which is something we actually did delay in the end for quite a while. But we talked about finding your sound and what makes a great album. And something, as Jack said, we think makes a great album is having a cohesive sound throughout and kind of recurring themes and motifs and stuff like that. So all those kind of things are in the back of our mind when we're trying to pick out our sound, as it were. But I think we benefit from the fact that we're older now and we listen to a lot of different music. When we were younger, it was very much alternative rock, a lot of grunge and kind of heavy rock. So we were always going to do that. There was never any doubt. We didn't even, after that battle of the bands, we kind of just played what we all liked. The covers were bands that we all listened to, because that's what happens at that age. You're into the same kind of music usually. But me and Jack have gone our separate ways, and we're bringing in lots more influences now. Like Jack said, folk and things like that, like music we never would have listened to when we were younger, which is kind of cool. But it's also makes it harder in a way to find that sound, because you've got all these different influences coming in and merging. So hopefully it'll turn out to be something interesting and unique, and not something that sounds weird and too obscure. But yeah, it's something we're still working on. We decided, we made a conscious effort to just get loads of ideas out. We had loads of kind of demos already on our computers that we were half finished, kind of get to the end of those. And I think we're going to put our heads together soon and try and figure out where this album's going sonically. One of the big problems we had is we started this project, or we came up with the idea of this project probably about a week before lockdown. So we envisaged that we'd be doing a lot more playing together. I've got a bit of a home studio here, kind of Jack coming over and jamming a bit and kind of finding the sound that way. Because of lockdown, and we've barely seen each other since the start of the project, which is pretty crazy. But we've been doing a lot of stuff separately just because we've been forced to do. So we've been going in slightly different directions, maybe because we've both been kind of jamming on our own to try and find a sound. But we're making a conscious effort now to try and bring those ideas together a bit more. But I wouldn't say we have a defined genre as of yet.
Yeah, you said something that got me thinking. Again, like kind of similar story about like the type of music I listen to and how it's changed and expanded over time. And when we were younger in our bands, like we didn't think about what genre we were gonna be. We already knew. It was just
there was only one genre.
Yeah, we had, like the blueprint was there. We didn't even discuss it, I don't think. No. We just this is the song I have, and it's like this. Oh, it's just like the song I have. So I wonder if that, because this is a problem I have a lot when I go to write and make music, is like, what kind of music do I want to make today? Because I'm into a billion things depending on where I'm at mentally. But it wasn't like that in the past. Every time I picked up my guitar, the distortion was on, and I was just slamming power chords pretty much. So sometimes I wonder if that's an advantage or a disadvantage, because even a lot of producers today, they're like very specific to like a certain subgenre of electronic music. Like we're in this bass subgenre where, it's got like all these like little very specific things about it that make it that genre. And I think just being there so many decisions have already been made for you. Just finding a home like that.
I think most of the time for us, it was probably we were trying to just copy bands that we liked, and we probably were just ripping off a load of bands that we liked. We used to play a lot of covers anyway, so it was probably more that. And now it's completely flipped. We wanted to replicate our heroes back then. That was like the key, was we wanted to sound like them. And now it's approaching it completely the opposite. We want to sound different and unique, and take things from those bands and ideas, but really want to sound different. But it's kind of got me thinking now, will it be more difficult to find that audience, or to connect with a certain audience, because if you had a defined genre, you would target that audience, or you would appeal to that area. Whereas if you're coming at it as a kind of undefined genre, are we going to find it trickier to find that audience at the start? Is it going to be a slower process? So that could be an interesting one. Maybe we need to pick a genre, Jack.
Yeah, well, one thing we have discussed a bit, which seems to be going hand in hand with the kind of accessibility of production equipment, is that these days genres seem to be blurring a bit more, and not just the genres themselves, but the audience for each one. You get people listening to more music, and all collaborating with, pop artists collaborate with rock artists, indie artists, hip hop, country, more, I think, than when we were growing up.
I'd agree with that.
I think possibly the internet has got a large part to play with that. I kind of ideas are exchanged. People are discovering music with, Spotify algorithms and things much more readily than they would have by having to go into a record store and buying something they'd never heard of before. So I think, probably not intentionally, but we're probably falling into that trend a little bit of kind of merging genres a bit, and hopefully that won't put people off too much.
So if you guys are 4 months into the process, was the idea to start from scratch? Like I have 4 songs from the last 3 years. It's just we're starting from scratch, or were there any rules in that?
We didn't make an official rule, and certainly we both had ideas that, well, I know I've taken some old ideas just to try and finish them off and get the creative juices flowing, if you like.
But we definitely didn't have any finished songs.
No. I think we kind of both like the idea of starting completely afresh rather than rehashing ideas from 10 years ago, if we can.
Yeah, there's like the kind of getting rid of all that baggage that comes with all the old projects and the past. It wasn't just had other bands since and other projects since, and there's definitely been ideas from those, but I've kind of put a bookend on that. And that, like Jack said, there's a few demo ideas that I had, but it's mainly been starting from scratch. I like the idea of, as I said, kind of documenting the process of completely nothing to a finished album in a year. I think when we started the project, we said, a year, what should we do? How long should we do? Like a year sounds like it's a challenge. Since then, after doing a lot of research, I found, probably including yourself, Brian, you've done projects in much, set much shorter timeframes than a year to kind of finish a project and things like that. But a year still feels like a challenge to us anyway, to fit it around everything else. And there was kind of a weird silver lining with the lockdown, is we have had a little bit more time to work on it, but it's definitely feeling like it's going to be a challenge to get it to what we really want, a really polished album at the end, and that's well produced and well mixed, because at this stage we're still hoping to do it all that ourselves. And I think the mixing side of things and the producing side of things is something that maybe we'll need to spend a bit more time on than the writing, but we'll see.
Mm-hmm. So that brings me to the question I had for you. If you've been doing this for 4 months and don't have the genre set, or like where are you? What have you guys been doing?
What have we been doing?
Like how far have you gotten? Like what has happened so far? If you can like kind of explain that to people, because it's not. I guess it can be, but it's not always just like, all right, I'm making a song today, and that's going to be one of our songs. Like, and when you guys are talking about having like a cohesive feel as well, like now this becomes a bigger picture than maybe just I jammed something out today and this is the song.
Yeah.
So, what have you guys been up to? Like, where have you gotten to?
Well,
what have you been up to?
I was hoping you wouldn't ask. I mean, we have written songs. We've done plenty of songs between us. One of the problems we had before this project, and we're still having to an extent now, is finishing songs. So we've got plenty of half songs that we've done since we started the project 4 months ago, and some of those we've finished. They're kind of complete songs now, which is progress. But we're at the stage where we allowed ourselves a grace period where we would just write as much as we want, completely different styles, experiment as much as we want, see what sounds good, and then come together at some point, probably not in the too distant future, and try and find trends between what we've written, what could work as a theme, musical motifs and things like that we can say, right, we've got a body of work here. These 5 or 6 songs are the direction we want the album to go in. So we're still kind of at that stage. I think when Rob was saying that actually a year is quite a long time to write an album, you don't need a year to make an album. I think maybe the kind of middle stage is where we're at. We're dragging that out. If we had 6 months, we would have moved on to selecting the songs we've written, which we like best, and trying to produce them and mix them and making them sound cohesive together. But as it happens, we've got a bit more time than we probably thought. So that stage hasn't arrived yet.
Yeah, it's we allowed ourselves a good grace period of jamming us and getting ideas down and figuring out the kind of sound. I think we've said it to us between ourselves a couple of times. Is it right? If that was that song we've got there, if that's the worst song on the album, then that's great. But I think we can do better. I think we're holding ourselves in, like, you kind of, as I guess we're learning as we go, you learn more and more about production techniques and different sounds and sound design. And then you surprise yourself with the next song you write slightly better and better and better. And then it's like, when do we start, do we keep going until we get to the point where we don't feel like we're getting any better, we're not improving anymore? That's kind of where we're at, because I think we do keep surprising ourselves with like, oh, this song sounds much more professional than the last one we did. And where do you draw that line to say, right, now these are the songs that are going on the album? I think the podcast, doing the podcast has helped us keep a bit more structure. I guess the first third of the project was basically me and Jack. If you go back and listen to the project, you'll kind of hear it's us getting a lot of things out of our heads, a lot of thoughts that we've had, kind of discussing what makes an album good, how do you go about writing an album from scratch, what are the key things you need to do. So there was a lot of just downloading of thoughts in those first few episodes, and now we're in the second third of the podcast and the project. And in the podcast, we're moving to kind of interviewing other experts and stuff like that. So that's why we wanted to speak to you, Brian. We've been speaking to other various people. In one of the last episodes, we had a close friend of ours who's written and produced his own album fairly recently. So we've downloaded all the thoughts in the first few episodes and discussed things amongst ourselves. Now we're bringing in some other thoughts from people who know a bit more about what they're doing than we do, or who might have been doing it a bit longer. So that's the plan. And then we can hopefully get some ideas from them, and that can go into the album. We'll keep building from there. But yeah, the podcast has helped us stay a bit more on track and have a bit more of a framework. But yeah.
Yeah, I heard you guys say something on the podcast that I've noticed about doing the podcast myself, is that talking through your ideas, writing your ideas out, really helps you process what you feel and what you think. And I've found by doing this podcast, talking to people, and some of the episodes that I just do by myself are really like me learning about what I think, which sounds kind of funny because you would feel like you know what you think, but it does take like this, like putting it into words and concrete form. That's super helpful to really like
Yeah.
get your direction together and understand like what you're trying to do.
And you realize that music production is not that different to a lot of other things that you, like other projects that you might
Oh
approach
yeah,
in
yeah.
life. Like that's, I mean, it's something that you talk about. You know, bring a lot of like books in on your podcast to kind of talk about things that maybe people wouldn't think were directly related to music. And me and Jack did a book basically called, did an episode called "The War on Art," which is kind of based on that Steve Pressfield book, which I had never ever applied to a music context before. Really, I'd always thought of it kind of from more of a, not a business book, but like more from in other contexts. And it wasn't until we started this project that I was like, oh yeah, all those things that I've read in that book or in other books
Yeah.
are kind of applicable. So you bring in these things that you've picked up from other areas of life into the musical production world, which is kind of interesting. Definitely, it's something that surprised me that I didn't think would happen.
Yeah, well, he's discussing writing, really.
Yeah,
in
exactly. Yeah,
his,
so he's not talking about music. Yeah,
but it might as well be music, you know. It might as well be a lot of things because the same principles apply. He's really, I think, talking about like getting to work and not lying to yourself about what you're doing. You guys talk about the resistance a lot in your
A lot, yeah.
podcast, realizing that like reorganizing my studio, though it might be somewhat productive, it is still a form of resistance. It's me not doing the work. It's me thinking I'm getting ready to do the work, but it's still pushing the work off. And and sometimes that stuff is necessary and very helpful. You know, you get a nice working space. But yeah, like he does just such a nice job of like showing you where you're just lying to yourself and kind of just giving you that kick in the butt to say like, come on, you know, all of that's great, but like nothing beats just putting the pen to the paper and doing it.
Yeah,
And
that's
showing up.
been showing up exactly. I mean, that's been the biggest thing. I think I've approached this after having a real job. So I hate saying that, but kind of having a 9 to 5 for the last however many years, and you approach it with a different attitude of like, I know at this age that to get the most out of a project, it is the work that you put in, and it is about setting aside time and sitting down and just doing it. And that was one of the biggest hurdles to overcome, was just knowing that you shouldn't wait for inspiration to strike. I think when I was younger and I was trying to write music, I'd wait to have an idea and then I'd run and grab the guitar. And there's still a lot to be said for that, but I would never sit down and go, right, I'm going to write some music today. I'm going to set aside 2 hours and do it. I'd wait until I really felt like doing it, and be really hard on myself if nothing good happened. If I spent 2 hours writing music and I had nothing to show. Whereas now, I think again, we speak about this a lot. Me and Jack have come to appreciate that if you have to get through the bad days of writing to get to the good days. And yeah, it's about putting in the work more than anything, and spending the time.
Yeah, that's very true. I mean, there is like, when you get that like lightning bolt that strikes you and you're inspired, I mean, that's amazing. And that's like the fun and the thrill. But it's rare. It's definitely rare. And if you don't have the practice, you don't know what to do with it. So by doing it every day, by being consistent, that's a lot of times that's when you get struck by lightning anyways. Like you have to get started. For me, that's always the hardest part, is getting started, to like actually sit down and decide I'm doing it. Because before I ever sit down and decide to do it, suddenly everything else in the world becomes really important. Like, I didn't do the dishes yet. There's like 4 dishes in my sink right now. Like, I better take care of that. I'm probably a much more like responsible adult because of my avoidance of the like my childish musician side. You know what I mean? That's like in the forefront, but the resistance like has somehow formed me into like an adult. But I noticed you guys like were doing, I think, weekly, right? And then you went to like a bi-weekly on the podcast,
Yeah, that's right.
like just
Yeah.
recently. Was that were you finding the podcast itself to be a form of resistance? Because like on one end, it is like a great motivating thing. Like we're talking about it, we're doing it. But from my experience with like collaborating with people, with playing with people, being in bands, to get anyone together to practice once a week is hard. And now you guys are trying to write, collaborate, and document it. It has to be, and I'm not. I think it's totally valuable. You know, I've really enjoyed like times with friends that I play music with where we just kind of talk about what we want to do and like plan it out and get a vision. I think that really sometimes makes the next steps come quicker. But there is the danger too that you can talk about it forever. So I guess what's the question? That's is has the podcast, as much as it's helpful, is it also sometimes a distraction or resistance at play? What do you guys think about that?
I guess that inevitably there's going to be weeks when we were doing it weekly where, with our jobs and everything else, we were busy, and recording and editing a podcast, along with kind of planning a podcast to get to a point where it's not just having a chat for half an hour. We've actually got something to talk about. There's going to be weeks where it's hard to fit that in, and it's especially hard to fit that in as well as do a few hours of making music and writing. So I think that was kind of the main motivation behind moving to bi-weekly. It is a fair question. There's obviously pros and cons. I like the idea that we've got two separate bodies of work that we're working towards, and hopefully by the end of the year we'll have not only an album, but we'll have a year's worth of podcast episodes, which could be a template for other people, or at least a kind of a document of what we went through. And I guess one hope is that if one of them's not firing, you know, we're struggling a bit with the album, then maybe the podcast is going well and we're learning something through that, or vice versa. So yeah, it's obviously more of a challenge to keep them both going, but hopefully it'll be worthwhile doing. I think it is.
I think the reason, there's a number of reasons why we moved from 1 week to 2 week to bi-weekly. I think at the start we were maybe a little bit arrogant about how we could do both of these things easily, and it wasn't until after I started to write music again properly and trying to finish songs, I realized how much work needs to go into it. And it was probably from doing the episodes on resistance that I took a step back and thought, are we just creating us some resistance here? You know, is the podcast just a form of resistance to stop us from doing the album? But I think it is. Well, at the end of it, like Jack said, it'll be nice to have those two different bodies of work, and hopefully they'll both be valuable. And I don't want one to kind of take precedent over the other necessarily. I think, it's the podcast. Sorry, what was I saying? Lost my train of thought. It was, completely lost my thought.
Well, I think what you were getting at was like, it's not really, it's kind of like two wins at the same time. Like, even if you're working on two things, so like you've got like two viable projects that are happening. Jack kind of mentioned that, you know, like even if like whatever happens, like you're still putting together this body of work in the podcast. And,
exactly.
That's the hope. Yeah.
Well, it is. It's an interesting journey to follow, to just hear like, you know, where are you guys at right now? What's next? And how is it progressing? And how does the whole holding yourself accountable with the podcast, how does that work into the process?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's. I think we kind of got more. We started off with the podcast kind of just being a chat. We just get together and when we could and just chat about thoughts, and then we got a bit more I guess we had started taking a bit more pride in that as well as the album, and wanting it to be the best quality and researched, and not just us chatting about the same stuff every week. You know, it has to be valuable for the people who are listening. We wanted it to be something that people could listen to. I mean, I'm well aware that there's it's great. I think anyone should kind of do creative projects, and I think there's value in it, even if we said at the start, like, yeah, I don't really mind if no one listens to it. You know, it's nice to just do a project like that and put it out there and into the world, and just for the sake of doing it, really. And it's a cool thing to do. So yeah, I've always said, kind of one of my mantras, I guess, is like, do interesting things, and interesting things happen, is kind of quite a good philosophy to live by. And I think, yeah, doing the album is one thing, but kind of doing the podcast is another. And that's already started to happen. I think one interesting thing that's happened from doing the podcast so far, apart from like getting to come on shows like this and stuff, is pretty much the first week I set up a Twitter account, put a few tweets out there, and got a message pop into my direct messages from one of mine and Jack's old neighbours, he lived just like 2 doors down when we were kids growing up, and he said, oh, I thought I recognized you guys. And this is someone we hadn't spoken to in, I don't know, I think Jack had spoken more recently, but I certainly hadn't spoken to him for like 15 years.
Yeah, talking years, definitely.
It was definitely years. And he said, oh, I've got my own music production podcast. He's a guy called James Russell. He's got a podcast called Appetite for Production.
Cool.
It's also
cool
a
name.
pretty, a pretty big, kind of gets quite a lot of listens. And he reached out and said, not only have I got a podcaster, but I'm a producer as well. And, you know, if you guys need help when you get down to the mixing end of the journey, or if you want help with the production side of things, then, you know, just let me know. So that was a perfect case, I think, of the podcast already paying off. You know, it's do interesting things, and interesting things happen. It's kind of, you don't know what's going to happen. Nothing might happen, but if you don't do anything, then nothing interesting is going to happen. So if you do something, then it vastly improves the chances of something like that happening. So yeah, already, I guess, just doing the podcast has proved dividends, because we might have a producer who can give us a hand on the album. So yeah, it's been really valuable so far, but I think we did make that conscious decision to go to bi-weekly because we wanted it to be as valuable as possible, but not to become the only thing. We don't want to end up with just a podcast at the end. We want to have the album as well. So we may build it back up. We may go back to, if we get enough ideas down, we may go back to every week. But I think we made a conscious decision to really make it the most valuable thing that we could, and really put as much time and effort in, whilst not sacrificing anything on the album side of things.
I think
ironic.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, go on.
No, go ahead, Jack.
I was going to say, I think ironically, it may be that when the music's going really well and picks up momentum, that could benefit the podcast as well, because when we're going through more different stages, we're going through mixing, we're going through mastering, we're going through track listing, all these kinds of things, which we hope to cover later on in the year, then they kind of inform the podcast really well, and we can talk about them. But at the moment, like we said, we're still at this kind of stage of experimenting with sounds, and there's only so many times you can tell your audience that that's what you're doing.
I think it's a nice way to look at it too, that like there's going to be value coming out of it no matter what, you know, and you're if nothing else, you're coming up with plans, you're coming up with ideas at this point, and this is something like other people can follow and learn from. And we don't always think of all those steps in the process, and even like you're talking about track listing, like, yeah, it's important, you know. Maybe it is important. I know for me, like growing up listening to albums, like it's the journey, you know. I still love albums. It's definitely not what I think most people are sitting down and doing these days, but you can still enjoy parts of the album separately. But I think there's something about a good album makes the individual songs even better.
Yeah, and it's definitely the kind of drive to, and a bit of a sadness of kind of the loss of the album was kind of another drive for it. I think me and Jack getting a bit old and grumpy, kind of moaning about like, remember back in the day when we used to get, you buy an album. We used to like walk home from school together, and we'd always call in at the local record store and like, buy an album pretty much every week. Like it was a big thing, and you'd treasure it, and you'd read the sleeve, and you'd really, you'd listen to it over and over again until you'd kind of got sick of it. But that just doesn't happen anymore. The great thing about Spotify and things like YouTube, you can access all these different kinds of music, but it's just so much, and you never really, I've made a conscious effort more recently to get back into albums and listen to more albums. But that's another big passion of both of ours, and something that hopefully we'd like the podcast to inspire is more people to get back into writing albums who maybe have I know I personally just got to the point where I was writing songs and putting them on SoundCloud and just individual songs and tracks. And I always liked the idea of doing an album, but I think for me it seemed like an impossible kind of body of work that would be so much effort I would never get around to doing it. So hopefully this process will show that Tunelighting as a process, like people can do it alongside a job or something like that. And I'd like to create a kind of, eventually one of the aims of the podcast, I'd like to try and build a bit more of a community of people who are thinking about doing it, help each other out, share ideas, share tips, and kind of give each other support along the way and feedback and things like that. So, because it can be a bit of a lonely process, I guess, like music production. We made a conscious effort a conscious choice to do it as a duo. But I know, like when I used to write music alone, it's fun, but it can get a bit lonely, and you want that feedback of you've listened to a song so many times, as you're mixing it, you lose all sense of, is this any good or is it not? And you can send it to a family member or play it to your girlfriend or something, and they might just say, yeah, it sounds great, but do they really know what they're talking about? It'd be quite nice to build a community of people that can share tips and tricks and things and lessons learned. So that's a big aim, kind of the big end picture I'd like to get it to.
Right. Well, I think in this idea of like appreciate an album, you mentioned like looking at the liner art and everything. What you guys are doing for your album is really cool. Like when the album is done, people could go back and like appreciate it on this other level of going through your whole process. There's a really awesome podcast called, I think it's just called This Is a Pixies Podcast, that somebody on this podcast recommended I listen to a couple episodes back. And it's documenting them making their last album. And it's awesome. I'd never listened to that album. I love the Pixies, but I hadn't listened to their new record. And I listened to this podcast of them making it. And then when it was done, I was like, all right, now I'm going to listen to it. And it made it just so much more enjoyable, like having the story and the process and then getting to hear it. And I was like, yeah, like I remember when they were jamming on this little idea and the song was called this, and now it's this song, and all the stories and all the drama of them trying to get their takes right. And it made it so much more enjoyable, and it gave it that human aspect. And I think, like there's like this world we're moving into where like computers can make music, AI can create music, but it can't make that story. It can't bring out that human side. And a couple months back, I did some shows with people about AI that were involved in the field, and we kind of like said, like, like if you look back to say the 90s or something, where people started wearing like flannels and ripped jeans, that's like directly based on the story of the music that came out in that time. Like if AI is going to produce like awesome music, like what's the story? What did the computer go through that we're going to relate to? And like, is it wearing like cool clothes that we're going to do? Like, it's not going to have that stuff. So like what you guys are making sure by doing this is that the human element's there, the journey's there, the experience is there. And it like, just like with that Pixies record, I'm sure that I wouldn't enjoy it as much had I not listened to the whole process and became emotionally involved and like interested in what they were going through. So
Yeah, it's interesting how much context can really affect your enjoyment of music. I've had similar instances where I've heard the story, or it could be about a certain lyric, where you kind of think, oh, that's a bit cheesy to begin with when you hear it. What does it even mean? And then you read up on what the song's about, or how that lyric became about. The singer met someone in a bar in wherever, and made, this whole story came out of that real life experience. And then once you have that understanding, you never listen to it in quite the same way.
Yeah, and like I think it makes a massive difference, kind of getting that insight into how things are made. I've got very into recently, and part of doing this project, listening to podcasts and watching YouTube videos of how albums and how certain songs are made, and kind of enjoying the most the songs and the albums that I would have initially dismissed as things that I'm not into. That's pop music, or it's not something that I would usually listen to, and those are the ones that I find the most interesting some of the time. And then you think, oh right, okay, there's a lot more effort has gone into this production than I initially gave it credit for, and I'm actually finding myself enjoying a lot of different music that maybe I wouldn't have listened to. So yeah, it's kind of interesting listening to the production side of things, and the insights that it gives you into the process. Definitely.
Yeah, I think it's a really cool thing you guys are doing, and definitely am excited to see how it plays out.
Yeah, I think.
Thank you.
So thank you very much. Yeah, and like you say, I think we need to. We're conscious that time's ticking on. I think we keep saying in the episodes we need to kind of push ourselves on and start getting some tracks down. But it is hard because there is no we're trying to create a bit of a template, I guess, but there's no defined template out there for writing an album. So where do you say we should have some songs by now, or do you leave it till like 2 months before and then you kind of cram it all in? It's strange, and we don't really know. We'll figure it out hopefully.
So where can people find the Tunelighting podcast and learn more about what you guys are doing?
So we're the Tunelighting podcast. You can find on any of the podcast platforms. I'm pretty sure it's definitely on Spotify, iTunes, Stitcher, and all the big podcast names that I can think of. So we're out there, and then we're also on social media as much as we can be, trying not to cause again too many distractions. But it's at Tunelighting. Tune and then lighting. On Instagram, Twitter, on Facebook as well. I want to make more of an effort to post some more things on there, because like you said before, it's a lot of the podcast is talking about ideas and very much chatting about that. But the music side of things, we've had a bit of feedback already of we've teased a couple of tracks on our on the podcast, kind of played a couple of clips, and we've had people say, "Come on, I want to hear more. I want to hear some more of those songs," or like a bit more of an insight into the visual side of the making music. So I'm going to make a bit more of a conscious effort to kind of film some of us recording and that side of things to go on the Instagram and the Twitter. So if people follow us there, hopefully they'll see that. That's where we are.
Yeah, that'd be fun for myself too, just to see like where you are, what things are sounding like.
Yeah.
And, don't worry about it. I mean, people never get distracted by social media. It's not going to prevent you guys from working.
It's not a thing.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So cool. So we're going to stop here. We're going to be doing another part of this, but that's going to be on the Tunelighting podcast, which I would think is, based on what we spoke about, should be available within like a day or two of this one going out on the music production podcast. We'll have part 2 up on the Tunelighting podcast. So if you're more than a couple days late after this came out, then it should already be there.
It'll be there.
Cool.
Thanks very much, Brian.
Yeah, thank you guys.
Yeah, thanks, Brian.
And I'll see you on the next episode of your show.
See you there.
See you in a couple of days.
Yep.